Welcome, everyone, to our Imagine Nashua Master Plan Committee meeting. I wanted to just go over with you a couple things due to the state of emergency declared by Governor Sununu as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, and in accordance with the governor's emergency order number 12, pursuant to Executive Order 2020-04, this public body is authorized to meet electronically until further notice. Please note that there is no physical location to observe and listen contemporaneously to the meeting, which was authorized to meet electronically pursuant to the governor's order. However, in accordance with the emergency order, this is to confirm the committee is providing public access to the meeting by telephone with additional access possibilities by video or other electronic means. So this committee is video conferencing utilizing Zoom for this electronic meeting. Public access to this meeting is provided by Zoom. The link to this meeting is contained on the meeting agenda, which is available on the city website as well as Imagine Nashua website as well. If anybody has a problem accessing the meeting via phone, please call 603-589-3064 and they will help you connect. I do need to do a roll call. All right, you can unmute yourself. When you do, please state that you are here and if you are alone. Scott LeClaire.
I'm here and alone.
Thank you. Adam Varley.
Here and alone.
David Tenza. Not here, okay. Raymond Gerino. Okay. Is Kate Lesko joining us this evening?
No, I don't believe she is. And just so you all know, Wendy Hunt will be joining in her place as the new CEO starting next month.
Yes, she will be joining us for our first public meeting. She was not able to make it tonight. Paul Shea.
I am here and I am alone.
Perfect. Is Dan O'Donnell going to be joining us as well?
I don't believe so.
Okay. John Jerzek.
I am here and alone.
Hello, John.
Hi
Scott
there.
Cote.
I'm here and alone.
Hello, Scott. Mr. Bob James.
I am here and alone.
Raymond Brousseau.
I'm here and I'm alone.
Thank you. Mr. John Spira Savette.
I am here and I'm alone.
Great. Marjorie Bollinger Hogan.
Hi, I'm here and I'm alone.
Hello. Jean Porter. Jean, you gotta take yourself off mute real quick, Jean.
I am here and alone.
Great, thank you. Heidi McDonald. No Heidi. Okay. Gloria McCarthy.
I'm here and I'm alone.
Peter Schaefer.
Pete Schaefer here and alone.
Hello, Peter. Mary Ann Malizi Goya. I know that she's going to be joining us a little late this evening. Homa Jaffrey. No Homa. And me, Amber Logue. I am here and alone. And with that, we can get started. So let's see. The first thing we wanted to do quickly is go over the social pinpoint update. We had a contest last month. Unfortunately, we can't see obviously who directed who to the site. So it was kind of a misleading, I guess, competition there. My apologies. However, we do have an update. We went from, I believe last month was 220. Julie, did you get the final number on what that was updated between the last meeting to this meeting? 1 second. We'll have it in just one moment. So as we're doing that, you can just by a show of physical hands, how many were able to go on and either add some comments or found that other people had, great conversation with you and engaged in adding comments as well? All right. Good. Perfect. So Julie, when you have that updated number, you just want to drop it in the chat? Perfect. That sounds great. And then Sarah, do you want to take what's next on the agenda? I'm just re-pulling it up here.
Thank you so much. So actually, we were turning it over to Will and the UTL team to be able to run through both the land use design and the strategic planning areas we're looking at as a preview for the April 6th meeting next week.
Thank you. Will, all you.
So is the screen visible and am I audible? Those are my first two questions. Okay, so just for reference, I am alone in this room, but I am not alone. There is a small child behind me. So if you hear screaming, that's what that is. He's not angry at you. He's just expressing himself. All right, so so here's our agenda, right? The main thing which we want to talk about is exactly what Sarah said, to talk about the priority redevelopment areas that we've been working on and sort of give you a preview for that. Some pieces are a little less formulated than other ones because we've been focusing on two. I would say that actually, you know, where it's at right now is as baked as it currently is. But based on the feedback from this meeting, we will continue to bake that, so to speak, before now in the public meeting. So we are eager to hear what you all think. So I don't need to overthink this too much, but, you know, we are deep in the section of plan development, right? We were working on existing conditions, visioning, and now we're sort of getting down into the brass tacks, or whatever metaphor you want to choose for that is, right? And so we have some initial parts of it that we've thought through. We have scenarios we're going to talk about with the public, and then based on, you know, your feedback, and then based on that feedback, the sort of what we do during the next big public meeting, we're going to sort of re-huddle down into things and actually work on a draft, the plan itself, which then goes through another round of revision. So, you know, here's a fairly recent screenshot of the same thing that Julie's going to look and get us the, you know, most up-to-date number on it. But the engagement has continued. We've gotten a lot of good comments, and the important part is not just to see a number that there's total visits, but as we've been working on these scenarios, the, you know, UTL and also the sub-consultants who we've been engaging to work on this stuff have been looking with a fair bit of detail at comments and feedback and the sentiment of it all to inform, you know, the pieces that we've been working on. So broad takeaways, right? There's the social pinpoint, but then there was also a set of focus groups, which, you know, we in collaborate, or the city in collaboration with us, you know, was running over the last couple of weeks, and we got a lot of good feedback, right? There's a lot of different things that people want to be getting out of the master planning process in general, but, you know, the topic areas which we had about land use, housing, and economic development are all things where there was a lot of room for work to be done in the project. I would say there was a lot of there was no one that just said everything's PG fine and there's like, we're good, we should all go home and focus on just, you know, one other specific topic. And so our job has really been to try to find the components of people's feedback that actually works together to become an idea. And that's really what we want to be showing you with these scenarios. I don't want to, we could go through this in great detail. This presentation will be on posted on the website, but I want to leave the majority of the time to actually focus on the scenarios themselves, because I imagine that's where you'll all have a lot to say. So again, like we took all the feedback from all these different topic areas and are weaving that into what we do. Okay, so I believe we mentioned this at a high level at the last meeting, that there's, you know, 6 different redevelopment areas that that, you know, the plan is focusing on. But what is it that they said in Animal Farm? Like, some are more equal than others, right? For our perspective, some of the redevelopment areas are a little more equal than others, and we are really focusing on what are number 1 and 3, the Amherst Street corridor and the Daniel Webster College site. That is not to say that we're not paying attention to the other ones, but for the amount of like full urban design, economic development focus that we're going to be presenting at the public meeting, it really is just going to be just the 2, because well, as you'll see when we get into them, there's so much in the 2 already that if we were to try to do all 6, it would be kind of like the last public meeting where everything feels rushed and we don't get necessarily good feedback. So what we're going to talk about with you is we're going to briefly go through all 6 and show you sort of where all those are. And then we can really dig into Amherst and Daniel Webster, if that makes sense as a plan. I just saw a chat. Is that to me, or I can't actually see what that is? Okay. All right. So first, Amherst corridor. The broad sort of analysis is, I mean, none of this is rocket science to you, but it's worth noting these are the existing conditions, right? This is a really heavily trafficked road, and there's a lot of issues with, all the different uses that are happening on it. It's really for cars only. So that's a big issue, right? There's another one, which is that as it's starting to turn over, things are changing in a way that necessarily isn't the most organized, right? This points out a recently allowed, expected residential development around the pond, but there's also mixed use development that's expected a little bit further down towards as you get into town. At the bottom there, on the bottom left, you'll see a chart which helps frame the relative position of the corridor to the city as a whole, right? There's, if you look at the industrial space, both by number of parcels and area of square footage of the land, not the gross, what you'll see is that it's something like 12 to a little under 15%-ish of the city, right? That is to say, it's not nothing, but it's not everything. It's just enough that it's important that the role of industry or of Amherst to the industrial base of Nashua is something which we need to be making a targeted and clear decision about. And that really guided a lot of what we were thinking.
Well, that has to do with tax base questions too, right? The tax base balance.
Yes, it's actually 2 things. It's tax base and jobs, right? Property tax is a pretty fundamental piece in New Hampshire for the way you should be thinking about what the growth of different corridors is going to be. So that matters. But industry versus commercial is also about the kinds of jobs that we collectively, as a committee, as a city, as a polis, want to sort of see happen. And so the sort of really broad principle to keep in mind is industry, when you have it, you can have it, but once you get rid of it, you don't really get it back. There's toothpaste and tubes, and there's cats and bags, and there's industry, and so the question becomes, how important is industry to the identity of the corridor or to the city's job base? And if there's other shiny things that seem useful as a future development, is it worth the transition? That's the fundamental question. We certainly have opinions about it, but it's also true that the public process itself, not everyone necessarily agrees with R1 assessment. And so that's what we can talk about tonight. And also we fully expect to have a healthy debate about. So there's the sort of guiding principles there. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail shortly. Oh, no, sorry, we're getting into this now, right? So Amherst Street is the corridor that we're looking at in great detail, but it sort of also plays a role relative to Daniel Webster Highway, which we didn't go into as much detail on, but for which I think the principles carry a lot of weight. So first of all, retail is something which is shifting rapidly, not just because of COVID. If anything, COVID maybe is exacerbating trends that were already well underway before, right? And so thinking through commercial uses as important to job creation, the property tax base of the city involves thinking beyond just the existing uses, either on Amherst or more saliently, on Daniel Webster Highway. What is retail when big box stores, are or aren't as present as they are right now? That's a big thing, right? Also, industry is shifting as well. The role or the synonymness of industry being manufacturing is not quite the same now as it was in the distant and not quite as distant past. That's a long way of saying that while you have that Amazon facility that's coming online across the river, not quite in Nashua's borders, that's not the end of that story. And when it comes down to it, last mile e-commerce and warehousing more largely is a trend that has been building for a while, and we don't see it slowing down. And there's a lot of reasons why Nashua is in a location where we expect it to continue to happen and where pressure is going to continue to build. Planning for that and deciding the level to which the city wants to embrace that relative to other kinds of office or commercial uses is a big question. That's one big thing which we need to be addressing, right? Separately, there's the repositioning of the corridor as, it's hard to know what the right phrase is, but we're calling it a mobility-oriented corridor, or maybe a not just car corridor, where it's not just about cars getting through, but also good usage for bikes, pedestrians, and to the degree that you continue to be getting it, public transit, whether it's bus or commuter rail in the future. Now that means, actually, it's like a chicken and egg question, right? Because you can't just add a bunch of bike lanes and sidewalks and call it good from a mobility corridor, right? You actually need to have there be things which people would want to either bike or walk to, which isn't really currently the case on either of the corridors, which becomes if one's the chicken, then the other thing, and one's the chicken or egg, then the other thing is creating the destinations or sense of place along the corridors that encourages that multimodalness. On the one hand, there's little pieces of it, right? It says, designing the street as a public realm, adding landscaping, green infrastructure. There's a lot that you can do in that right of way of the road itself, but there's also how those uses relate to the, potentially warehousing or industrial or other commercial uses that we're seeing developing on the corridor. And all of that is a lot of, that broader idea that we call placemaking. When you have commercial fronts, they do definitely need to be active. If it's not retail, then it might just be facades, signage, and other kinds of things that make it feel like a place that isn't just where cars drive by on their way to the big box store or to drop something off. Okay, so for Amherst Street, this is our first pass at taking those broader goals and putting them into sort of the next more targeted version of strategies, and then the way more detailed, specific implementation change details that would need to go into zoning or, a redevelopment project. This is the most fleshed out one that we have because we've been working on it in such detail, right? So first, we only have a couple levers that we get to use as planners, right? We can't force people to do anything. It's not just because you're in New Hampshire and have certain mottos, but that it's not the way it works in America. And so in many ways, one of the big levers is it really is zoning and the amount of stuff that you allow, and then in exchange for allowing it, what you expect in return. And so one of the levers is, okay, there's a current state of affairs that is operational on Amherst Street. We could upzone along the corridor to allow more, but then we have to decide what we want in exchange for the more. So one piece is it's nice to have more in that it could encourage land values that would actually lead to the redevelopment, because it's not like there's vacancy. It's not like the street is dead and there's just a lot of empty stuff waiting for a good reason to be there. It's actually functional as is. So the only way to actually see change in the medium or long term, we think, is actually to upzone, to actually sort of put our thumbs on the scale that would encourage a kind of change or revisioning. There's a lot of things that we can do on the right of way. This is what we're talking about for dimensional constraints, which we'll show you in the 3D shortly, which will, we hope, get at all these things about reducing the auto-orientedness of the corridor and allow for other kinds of uses. It still is a corridor for autos, right? Whether it's for autos and trucks driving up and down it, making sure that those are confined to a certain part of the road, so the rest of the road is available for all the kinds of things that we want to do. So there's a lot of rules about zoning, basically, and other kinds of things. The second two bullets on the right, it's not just changing setbacks and lot size, but also a couple major interventions, right? There's this idea of a carriageway, which we would want to add. In other words, if you want a New York City subway analogy, there's like the express train and the local train, right? And you've got the heavy traffic that's using the thoroughfare itself and trucks and stuff. That would be sort of on the the slightly trimmed part of the roadway itself. And then we would create a carriageway, a secondary road with some diagonal parking on the side that would allow for the sort of local uses and patronizing of businesses and shops and stuff along the redefined edge to happen, separate from messing with the traffic on the major part of the road. And then the last one is this idea of a verge, right? There's a lot of different words for it. The verge, median, sidewalk strip, the thing that is kind of unbuilt green in between the sidewalk and the road. That is something which doesn't really exist in a meaningful way right now on Amherst, but that can become a supersized idea that allows for not only stormwater management, but also bicycles and other kinds of mobility uses. So those are all the things which we've been trying to jiggle there. For Daniel Webster, it's a little bit less clear. In many ways, or that's not true, sorry, it's a little bit less formulated because I would say many of the principles that we settle on for Amherst Street, a lot of that we believe should carry over to Daniel Webster Highway. In a lot of ways, they share a lot of similarities, right? They are both major commercial corridors that are very auto-centric, but the big difference is the existing mix of businesses and retail and big box uses on Daniel Webster, we see less likely to change in the immediate future. So because they operate as they are. And so we would see that, quite frankly, as a more long-term vision. And depending on how the conversation goes around Amherst, some version of that would be a visioning concept that down the road would want to be implemented for Daniel Webster Highway, to broadly oversimplify there. Oh, and just one last thing at the bottom there, parking, reducing parking requirements is key to both of these to sort of allow room for all this stuff. Okay, so the other big one that we've been talking about is not Daniel Webster Highway, but the Daniel Webster College. And we spent a long time looking at it from an urban design perspective, from an economic development perspective, from an open space and public benefit perspective. And the simplest piece that we have for it is that the summary that our economic development consultant Integrate Partners Kevin Heildy had to observe was that what this actually is the perfect site for is a small private college. That's the perfect thing for it. So if you could just put another small private college there, we could all go home, right? But that's not really what we see the market doing at the moment. So given that that isn't the best case, or that the best case scenario isn't the most likely scenario, given all the other constraints on the site, what can/should we do? So let's talk about all the constraints, because on the one hand, the big pro is it's a big place. It's sort of up for grabs. And so the sky's our limit if you look at only the positives. So then the constraints become what we have to think about next. It's next to an airport. That's kind of a big thing, whether it's noise or just having a funny neighbor. It's also next to a bunch of residential. So that kind of means that whatever you want to do is going to need to get along with the neighborhood. There are streets which, while not purely residential, aren't ginormous, right? The road that goes right along the airport has more access, but getting in and out of the site via only that road versus the ones that directly get you onto the parcel is a little bit convoluted. So it's kind of in the middle ground of accessibility. And finally, the buildings themselves. There are some new ones that we could imagine could be reused, but there's a lot of buildings there that are actually just kind of small little college buildings that work really well as college buildings, but aren't obviously retrofittable. And so that means that a full-scale redevelopment of the parcel would probably mean removing a major portion of the campus, which kind of limits your options because you have to addition to sort of standard development costs. So those
Well,
I don't think any of that is shocking to any of you, but really
you dropped out for a minute, Will. Yeah.
I don't know where did I stop? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you said a sentence or two. You were talking about the buildings not being suitable for redevelopment.
Apologies, and if I break up again, please stop me. As you can see, I have a way of kind of going. So the last piece is that means that the redevelopment of the site involves removing the buildings, which is an additional hurdle. It's an additional cost. It's an additional sort of thumb on the calculation, on the scale of the calculation of what you can put there, which is actually in many ways one of the biggest constraints. So if we take a step back, there's a lot of things that if money were no object would be the most amazing thing to put on the site, right? We heard a lot both at the public meeting and from feedback that the city's given us that they've heard through other outreach that there's a lot of needs for community stuff, right? There's these open spaces that are in a city that is currently has a bit of a dearth of one would be really, really important to preserve. We heard a lot of feedback at the public meetings about community uses. It'd be a great place to sort of have room for nonprofits. Like all this makes sense, but this isn't a publicly owned site at the moment. And the current owner of it isn't, trying to give it away to exclusively have it be for public purpose. So we can't get everything that we could possibly want. So more specifically, property tax revenue is an important driver of what could potentially happen here, which really means that with all of those constraints, it seems like there's sort of two big things that we need to think about, right? Office is kind of complicated. It doesn't obviously speak as a commercial, business park or something, given all its proximity to it. But, the big questions around, should it be housing? Should it be, creating homes to deal with the housing crisis as it exists in Nashua is one big consideration that would both achieve property tax goals, but also achieve policy goals, or thinking about additional capacity for industrial and or sort of that heavier commercial side of things that could get along with the airport become the two big questions based on all the other constraints that we have, which means that the viability of that becomes the biggest question. We think that the two big pitches are exactly that. Either you can fit moderate density, not ginormous, but at a scale with the neighborhood, townhome-ish residential development, or as more of a stretch, you could potentially have a small-ish industrial park, assuming you can find industrial uses that get along or in fact are encouraged by the airport. We don't think an industrial park is ideal because of all the truck access. It just isn't where, if you could pick where to put an industrial park based on all the stuff I was just saying about Amherst is better. Like that's a more likely place to put it. If for some reason the market shifts and Amherst is just popping at the seams, it's possible to consider, but the most likely scenario for what sort of based on the constraints can achieve policy goals of having something fit that's good, that can fit the price point, most importantly, of demolishing some existing part of the campus and still get built, it has to be residential. The nice thing about that is there's enough space that's contiguous that the sort of open space, the existing fields, maybe a modest redevelopment or increased development of a small community center or something there can fit alongside it nicely. So you can we can have some version of the cake and we can eat some version of it too, where something productive for the city can come out of it. We can protect the community assets as they exist and it's possible. That's sort of where we've fallen into it at the moment. Okay, moving right along. And I want to keep going through all these so that we have plenty of time to come back really to those two. So I'll try to keep these fairly brief. East Hollis, right? This is a transit-oriented kind of site. There's already a lot of multifamily that's gone into place there. Development is happening. The master plan's task is not to rethink through all of it, but really to maybe help organize this so that things happen and don't happen, or that we don't realize there's something we need to do after the fact. So what we really see there is that it's really just design standards. When it comes down to it, that's the biggest thing we need to change. When we were looking at zoning or other kinds of issues, we don't think that sort of regulatory piece of things is a big piece. And so the design standards, the walkability, the signage, the public realm things that we have in much more detail at the moment on really that Amherst vision, and to a slightly lesser extent on the vision for the Webster College, is a chance to talk through what those kinds of improvements should be and get feedback from the public on how that sort of sits well. And assuming that we don't hear anything completely out of left field, we expect to have some version of that multimodal mobility and public realm focusedness, in these standards as well. Broad Street. This is on a completely different scale than the other focus areas, but there is that question about when you come off the highway, what really is this place and how should it be, right? This isn't transit oriented, but it is still a question around placemaking. And for that, we think there's two things you can really do. That lever, which I was mentioning for Amherst Street, that lever can be pulled here as well, right? As we're about to get into, if you're trying to figure out and possibly hedge a little bit for the future of what your job creating base should be, especially given that there isn't a deep industrial district all over the place, the future of e-commerce and warehousing and all that kind of stuff means that we do think that having truck access and access to the highway is an important thing that Nashua can provide and does provide based on its location and being in New Hampshire with all the things that affects with sales tax. And so having the ability to have warehousing and or industrial on the ground floor when it's possible, we think is a virtue and worth preserving. You can build industrial on the ground floor of a building, and you can have commercial on top of it going up to about 85 feet. And you can still build at a lower price point. It's a typology which we're seeing happening all over the Boston metro area, both in the city of Boston and other cities that we've been working in. And we think allowing for that through upzoning can both preserve that kind of range of job creation character and be financially viable. We think that we should allow it on Amherst. We think you should also be allowing it here as well in the areas right by Route 3. On top of that, to encourage other development that isn't just, exclusively that one big chunky thing. We think that in this case, this would be a good place for a form-based zoning, that is to say zoning that's about the shape of the building, not necessarily the stuff within it. Have a little overlay that just fits in this little spot. Don't redo all of Nashua zoning. Don't, in fact, redo all the different districts right around here, but to help with the placemaking process, create an additional overlay that allows for the bigger height, that allows for that lever to get pulled if you so choose, but requires sort of dimensional and form-based constraints along the corridor to create a better sense of place. That would be the big change there on Broad Street. And then finally for Northeast Boulevard, we're calling this idea the idea of industrial repositioning, right? And at the moment, you can see that it's a currently industrial space, but it's starting to become other stuff, which in many ways is a sign that there's something wrong between the zoning and market, right? That the current zoning isn't currently working perfectly for industrial uses if non-industrial uses are finding their way in and creating a lot of variances. And so our task is to update the zoning or propose what the updates to the zoning should be so that it gets back on track. And for that typology of the 85 feet, allowing for redevelopment, allowing for height is important. But here, it's also a different piece, which is when you allow industrial and you allow other kinds of uses, and they're both viable, oftentimes the non-industrial things will always happen because they're highest and best use. It often makes more money to build commercial versus industrial. So if you actually want a place to be industrial and the market makes it generally viable, you have to require it these days. And so that point about having industrial on the ground floor and being able to build commercial above it is the way that you can upzone, allow for redevelopment, but still expect space and ensure the industrial character of a place. So if you're going to upzone it, if you're going to do it, you have to require industrial in these kinds of places. That would be the request that you get in exchange for allowing redevelopment, and that would help keep it from turning non-industrial. And in that sense, this really is a question around preservation, right? this would be a question that we have to talk about, with the public and hear about. But in some sense, what we're actually saying is where industrial is working and where it could work, you have to preserve it. You have to actually go out of your way to continue to possibly have it, because once you don't have it, it's gone. And then
I think just to expand on that a minute, Will, multifamily housing tends to be a higher, better use than either commercial or industrial.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And,
yes.
And I think our provisional recommendation, again, these are trial balloons to discuss with this group and then to discuss with the public, is that in the medium and long run, it would be good for Nashua to continue to have both an industrial real estate portfolio and a commercial real estate portfolio. And so this zoning tool, which is to encourage the market to build newer industrial space as part of a mixed use building at higher densities, as part of the same logic that Will's been talking about, that you upzone, but with that upzoning, you ask for the kinds of uses that in terms of the overall city portfolio of real estate helps with the tax base, helps with the mix of jobs, and helps make sure that from an economic development standpoint, Nashua is always a kind of complete city. And so go ahead, Will.
And the only last piece I'll say there is, in a weird way, that's why Daniel Webster actually is affecting this conversation and all the other ones. We really wanted, going into this, without looking at the economic development feasibility of this, we wanted to be able to say, we could make the Daniel Webster College site a special new industrial park. It's kind of blank slate. We could put new stuff on it. It's near the airport. It all gets along. It seems great. But when it comes down to it,
one more point, only because Will, there's been a couple of comments about tenant uses in those buildings. We'll come to this, I think, during the Q&A. But when we talk about industrial and commercial, we're only talking about space typologies. We're not talking about the uses that go in there. And one of the advantages of a mixed commercial industrial building is that technology companies like those kinds of buildings. Life science companies like those kinds of buildings. So we're not yet prescribing the uses in those building types. We're just talking about the kinds of flexible buildings that can accept then that list of uses that are usually in the zoning table, R&D, light manufacturing, technology, whatever those uses are. But just because we're using the word industrial, that means high bay ground floor space that has truck access. It doesn't mean there's smelting copper in there. If you know.
Yeah, we're not saying you should smelt copper all through Nashua. To take the extreme. Absolutely. And I'm sorry, that's a shorthand that I'm used to saying. So I appreciate the clarification there. But what I was going to say, sorry, is that if we had concluded that the Daniel Webster College site is a good place for that high bay kind of use, then these could all be different conversations. Then it's less of a question about preserving the areas that are industrial because we think there's a good place for it where you can focus your efforts. Unfortunately, while we wanted that to be the case, just the issue of the roads just precludes it when it comes down to it. Because maybe you could design buildings that would work for it there, but one, they're too expensive after you have to worry about tearing down the college. And then two, the trucks are going to make all the neighbors angry when they're driving in and out and the roads don't fit them anyway. So that being how it is, assuming there aren't massive shifts in the demand for it, if that has to be housing, then where we have industrial, we have to think very carefully about preserving the parts of it where we can, or concentrating it where we can, and then disallowing it where it's not realistic. Okay, so where we're going to go from here is I want to show you 2 slides, and then we're going to switch to an actual little tool. It says Miro board discussion. That's for you all, just so you know. These are basically just 2 sort of screen captures of it that when we put the presentation up after the fact, it'll be useful for the public, right? We have a little tool that we're going to be able to sort of zoom in and out. You can almost see it. It's like the pinned up board of all of our thought process on it so far. But okay, first let's look at the corridor, right? There's sort of the existing condition of, really on the airport side of Amherst Street. We're looking at it as if it's just Amherst Street. There's big box retail, some industrial stuff, a lot of parking setback from the road, and then some office parking and some smaller businesses and shops still with a lot of parking. Then on the
Well,
other
it's,
side,
it's worth Will, it's worth saying that this is not an actual location on Amherst Street. It's a reasonable simulacrum of the Amherst Street that you know, but without getting specific about actual subdivision, actual shopping centers, actual big box. It's a
that's right.
You know that as Amherst Street, but you don't know exactly where it is. It's like just to be clear about that. And we often do that with planning. We create a kind of customized generic before to have these discussions, so that people aren't. That's my property. That's why we do that.
So that, you're talking about the big idea, not the details, because first we have to get agreement on that. Okay, so that's what we have on one side. And on the other side, you've got, some level of offices and shops with some regularity along the other side of the street, with either multifamily or single family neighborhoods a little bit further back where there's more topography. So that's how it is right now, with some mixing and matching of that as you go out, right? Then what we are proposing with some mix and matching that we'll get into is basically along the road, this upzoning and this densification as we've been talking about it. The buildings have to be taller than is currently allowable to actually get the redevelopment to happen. In some locations, residential should be what goes on top. In some locations, offices should be on what's on top. What you can see also is that the sort of in between these two buildings, everything is completely different. The road is still the road, the same number of lanes, but the right of way, the area that kind of is occupied by transportation-y stuff, gets wider. We actually think that what you would need to do is kind of eat in to the parcels on either side to leave room for more stuff, the carriageway and all these other kinds of pieces. And so that's the big move too, right? Is buildings come in, and then we do a lot of the stuff that we were touching on before that we can go into more detail on. But actually we have to go beyond where the existing sort of state-owned highway is, and it would involve more of a process on the private property, but it would be what allows for this other kind of vision. So that's sort of the give and take that we're thinking about at a very, very high level. Right? So
yeah, and I think that's the carriageway. And the important thing to realize though is that on private property, if the buildings get moved closer, those private developers would want to build some frontage and vehicular access points anyway. So it's not putting it bluntly, it's not a land taking. It's the coordination of what the market would want to do anyway. And we'll explain that with some more drawings.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right, that's a good point. Because what we're actually just doing is organizing what would otherwise need to happen were you to redevelop, that scale. Okay, so for Dina Webster, there's more color on the industrial options because that's sort of where we literally got started on it. And so we really tried to think through, were you to be able to put in an industrial park that were smaller, that could kind of go with the airport, you could make it work. You could kind of fit the things. It could be nice, though it isn't the most economically viable thing. We could even potentially find a way to squeeze it, make it be smaller and leave some of the existing recreational spaces that are, on the south side of the campus. But actually the more black and white one, which we came to after more sort of internal discussion, is what we see as more feasible. It doesn't have to be this exact layout, but basically something at the scale of townhouses, right? Not so big that would be completely out of scale with the residential neighborhoods surrounding it, but also something where you actually get things of value with recreational stuff to the south. That's really where we see this one going. So I don't want to get into this yet. I want to switch to Miro. So I talked a lot. So now is where I think I'm going to switch it to be the interactive view of these different things. And I would propose that this becomes question and answer from here on out. I'm sure you all have many.
Thank you so much, Will. That was great. Question and answer. If you want to, if we have a lot of questions, if you want to start putting them in the chat. If we don't, then just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Amber, I have a question to Will and
your team. In doing strategic planning with the Board of Aldermen, one of the things that was noted is the economic impact of the airport and the importance of the airport, and the importance of supporting the growth of the area around the airport for additional businesses that might be compatible with the airport. And I'm just wondering, have you had any conversations with the people at the airport, or has that been considered? Not necessarily industrial, but maybe office spaces, or I don't know, a small hotel or something, because there has been the concern about the noise from the airport and how it would impact residential. And I know I live in Ward 8. I know I hear from my neighbors and other people in the city concerns about the airport because of the increased air traffic. And certainly in the past year, we haven't seen that. But we also certainly hope that the traffic in and out of the airport will grow, because we recognize it is a driver. And I know things have gone on at the state level to look at making it more attractive to keep airplanes here, because that has been an issue in terms of taxes and competing with places in Massachusetts. But certainly the feeling has been that we should look at growing the airport from an economic perspective for the city. So sorry,
Marianne, actually,
it was a lot.
This is Sarah. Actually, can I jump in first just
Yeah.
about how we've talked to the airport? Yes, we have had a focus group meeting with the Airport Authority, and they are excited to come on April 6th. They are open to uses there. They are an economic engine for the city. They are concerned with the stagnation of Daniel Webster College, and they are concerned with noise complaints. And so you'd see with some of this work, the preservation of the large wetlands between the site and the woods involved with that and this. But they'll be here as part of the conversation, and they were very much looking forward to it. But the problem with office space is it's not economically viable. And so that's one of the key pieces that the team that UTIL has brought together, is a really good economic development consultant, so that we know that what we're planning for is actually grounded in reality.
Okay.
But to answer your question directly, that was our hunch at first. So we tested smaller floor plate industrial buildings that could also be commercial with that reasoning, Marianne. And I think that it's certainly viable. It's more viable if it's a full redevelopment site with the rec fields going away too. It's a little bit less viable because of the area that you're left with to make that work. But I think if there's more targeted ideas about an economic development strategy or tenants, I think from a kind of space planning standpoint, it works. The only complication is vehicle access, and especially truck access, which we looked at coming in on the airport road and looping back in on the drive that's within the campus as a one-way system, as an opportunity. But I think that it could work well as a denser residential development too. We're showing single-family townhouses that have tuck-under parking to limit surface parking, with a series of greenways that connect the woodlands on one side to the wetland, and on the other is a kind of habitat green network that connects the two. It's very hard to see in that plan that we had there, but that was one of the more recent options that we looked at, so that you would have a view of green either direction outside of your townhouse.
Okay, and certainly if anyone's going to build residential there, I would assume they're going to consider whatever they can do to put into a new building to buffer sound. But yeah, I'm sure the airport was concerned about noise concerns because we have had those.
Yeah, I mean, it partly explains the orientation of the townhouses relative to the airport. But you're right. I think it would require any developer to study all those kind of technical issues in detail, and might be a showstopper, maybe not. It also might be something that the developer would take on in terms of soundproofing the buildings, having a higher quality of windows and those kinds of things, which is often done near airports anyway. But I think your comments were excellent.
The only thing I would add to that is at the level of very high level spitballing, we are trying to figure out what are the most obvious ways you could latch on to the airport as an obvious connection to this thing, right? And so one is, like you're saying, offices, et cetera, that make sense alongside the airport. So but then the immediate jump was what we're just saying. One, the access for trucks and vehicular isn't so great. And then two, you have to first demolish the existing college buildings before you build this stuff. And at that point, if you're paying that much to build the office space, there's so many other places in the city where you could also just build office space with better access for cheaper. We couldn't figure out a way where it could make sense. The only kind of outlandish vision, which again, we just were like, let's consider everything, is like, what if we went in, like, we tried to imagine a jet setting community for like residential in the airport.
I was going to say that, but
like,
I'm glad, Will, you're raising this issue in our brainstorm.
No, it's okay. I mean,
yeah.
So, we're like, you own your plane, like you're saying, New Hampshire's making it easier. Like, and then you got access, like you got your little house, you don't care about the noise, this is your thing, right? And like, sure, like logistically that makes sense, but we're not in Palm Beach, right? Like the exact vision for that for Nashua isn't quite so clear. And so what we're talking about in the meantime is something where we're assuming the area stays important. We'd like to see activity in the airport. Actually, having a robust commercial, like this is good for the economic development of the city writ large. And assuming we build homes that are, appropriately soundproofed, which is of course a doable thing, and that people know that's where they're going to be moving next to, it should get along. And to whatever degree, having a robust airport to feed the commercial activities of the city improves quality of life and the vitality of Nashua, that's good for a neighborhood too. And so,
just to give you a sense of how far we went with the scenario, we imagined that there would be groups of 4 or 5 houses, and each of those would have a golf cart with an off-street path to get to the airport to your airplane. So we we went down that kind of development scenario rabbit hole a little bit, which would be pretty cool. So.
There's two questions that kind of tie in with this exact conversation. If you just want to take a quick, flying cars, the Jetsons, right? It's the Jetsons community. If you want to just take a quick read of those questions and kind of answer those as you're answering this one, does the property support more workforce housing, or are we looking at high-end residential is the first part? And then to carry, right into that, is there a way to integrate, some of the other buildings that are there, or community spaces with like childcare center, playground, sitting spaces, etc.?
So to try to work on both of them, yes, absolutely a placeholder. It was more like we spent a lot more time trying to make the other thing work because we wanted it to. So what you're seeing in that image is really about, in fact, I don't even know if Andrea, which one is it even on this one? Anyway, the point is, yeah, absolutely a placeholder. It's more about sense of scale. That's the scale that we generally see there. It's our job to do some more sort of site planning on the site itself before now and next week, so that we're not just showing like some quick line diagrams. So yes.
Yes, well, if you go further right, you can zoom
I'm sorry.
into.
I'm trying to do too many things. Can't get my mouse to work right now. For the right, wait, is it way out? I'm sorry, maybe.
Yeah. Way to the
over
right.
here, right?
Yeah.
You're in our
Okay.
process boards and not our
I'm
final.
sorry, I was stuck. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Right. So yeah, so we have triplexes. We also have townhouses. They're rows. It doesn't have to be that way. It's always important when you're doing urban design to start with the most obvious one, like the most basic thing, so you get a sense of capacity, and then you play from there. So we're still a little bit.
There's a photograph at the top of the stuff to the right that shows the kind of look and feel of what we had in mind with the greenway. Do people see that?
Yes.
So that would be those would be the green fingers that would connect the wooded area with the wetlands area, so that, you know, from an ecological standpoint, you would connect those habitats and make that part of the asset of a residential community there.
And to the other question about supporting more workforce housing versus high-end residential, we haven't figured that out with the perfect fine-tipped pencil. But I would say where we're at right now with it is, because it's not greenfield, because you have to remove a college to put in the housing, maybe a couple buildings get to stay. Putting anything like the subsidy that could normally go into really getting as much workforce housing and other public benefit, some of that goes away, because actually the use of the site at all ends up being part of that. Now, it's not quite that simple. There's always still more wiggle room within that. It just becomes a question really of how high you want some piece of it to go to allow fitting on other kinds of things. And I think that's actually part of where we need discussion from the public.
Yeah, I think the other piece of that is that if it was a denser, more compact community surrounded by green, I mean, you still hear the planes, but as you can see in these kind of aerial views, there's green all the way around this, which is the quality of the campus today. You know, what probably makes sense then from an ecological footprint standpoint is either, you know, individual townhouses or duplexes, or we looked at a 3-unit prototype that we developed to kind of plug that in too, is that while the housing wouldn't be workforce or affordable, it would be a different housing choice at a lower price point, because the square footage would be lower, and there wouldn't be a big private yard. You know, the greenways as a kind of shared amenity would be the yard for that collective along each of the greenways. So we think that it would present another interesting housing choice in Nashua, in addition to the people that own planes, you know,
that's the last piece, which I don't think we've said at all yet, which is just, it's worth, we're not going to get into all the very big details of it, but when it comes to sort of housing policy and how that should go for a master plan, there's a lot of, and actually like even the phrase workforce housing means a lot of different things to a lot of people, right? And so given the fact that developing anything on the site is not immediately attractive, it requires some thought to make it happen. We don't think our effort should be sort of the standard process of putting together a 20 sources of funding, low income housing tax credit project, to just like actually finding a nice plan that could create supply is an important step. What Tim's talking about is, once you assume it's going to be market on some level at all, there's a separate question around that flavor of what you mean by workforce housing, which is smaller homes are cheaper. So modestly sized housing that allows for capacity can still be valuable from a market perspective and more affordable if you create it. But that requires, you know, specific conversations about what you want to go with. That's why, though, for whatever it's worth, we're showing somewhat dense, smallish rows, because we're not suggesting that this become a bunch of high-end, big, sprawling single-family homes or really fancy condos. We're trying to get at that, but still have it be, you know, run by the market.
Amber, are there other questions around this particular site that you want to field from the chat, or encourage others to ask before we move to?
Yeah, does anybody else have questions around this property, or do you want to move on to another one? I see a couple questions in here. Bye, Homa. Thank you for joining.
Or can I ask, you know, does anybody else have want to talk more? Marianne asked some great questions about the the other besides housing use. Does anybody else want to see more of that industrial kind of that they tried to play with, or does everybody kind of fine with talking on this house with the housing
Actually,
side?
okay, there's one last point that I see Peter Schaefer wrote a comment about requiring lots of space and where industry goes or doesn't go. And that reminds me, there's something which I completely neglected to say before, which is a crazy looking diagram at the moment that we have been basically trying. Oh my gosh, I can't run a meeting and find it all as I go. Okay, I'm just gonna not even, I'm gonna talk, I'm sorry. Basically, there's 3 big areas where we're looking for, all along Amherst Street, right? And really what it comes down to is Route 3. There's the exit that's further south, and then there's the exit that comes off the connector a little bit further north on the road itself. And actually, Andrea, for example, if you could find your way to it, and then I'll click, I will follow your, oh no, you left it, never mind, you know what I'm saying. So you've got the bottom exit of Route 3, and then you've got the second exit of Route 3, right? That's a little bit further north. And so we've thought about dividing the corridor into 3 different stretches. And if anyone at the util team tells me where I should be zooming, I will zoom to it, right? So the catch is, at the moment, there's a lot of residential happening, that recently permitted thing that's planned for the outermost stretch of the corridor. All else being equal, that seems like, as Peter was pointing out, the place where industrial gets pushed to. So from a tabula rasa perspective, it would seem like that would be where we would want to encourage new industrial development. However, given that there's a mixed use thing already being permitted there, and there's a lot of sort of positive aspects for residential uses, we actually think that that should really be the sort of residential on top aspect of the typology that we showed you there, and just sort of commit to it. Should I follow? I'm going to follow Andrea's. If you could do the zoom, if you could drive it, Andrea, I'll keep talking. So that's one piece. That would be the outermost section. Then this sort of middle section that's just to the northwest of the connector Route 3 exit, that would be where you are at the sweet spot between traffic and space. So that's actually where the trucks in the industrial and all that kind of legit, there it is. That's the diagram that we were looking for. Right, thank you so much. So yeah, so the outermost zone, that sort of red chunk here, right? This sort of area is where, given the already permitting qualities, that would be where we want to have more of this sort of residential on top. This piece of it here, the sort of middle section, up until you get to the Route 3, that would be where you would want to have the typology of, for actually the bigger 4-plate kind of warehousing or industrial to potentially fill in things as redevelopment is happening behind it. And at that point, you could actually put the carriageway and additional circulation behind if you need to for circulation's perspective. And then further down on the part that's between the 2 Route 3s, that's not good for any more industrial anymore, just because there's going to be too much traffic from all the other uses. And so at that point, it's going to need to be sort of a combination of commercial and or residential.
You can already see the market responding that the best place to be on Amherst Street is between the arterial road that brings you from the northern Route 3 exit to Amherst Street, and then the intersection that gets you right on Amherst. That's the sweet spot in terms of value from a kind of big box retail locational standpoint, because you're capturing 2 captive audiences. Industrial's fine to be a little bit further west on Amherst because they'll just know what exit to use. And then in a way, because as you leave Nashua headed on Amherst Street 101 to the west, that's a good place to live from a kind of an amenity standpoint, because you're right at the doorstep of, beautiful rural New Hampshire. So that was our logic about thinking about Amherst Street as a kind of thermometer of uses. But that's why industrial is better with that easy highway access than having to take a slightly complicated residential street to get to it. That's the problem with industrial on the campus site. That
the industrial has to be as close as possible to that exit. That's it. If it's not, there's no reason to be there. And so basically that little nubbin just north of the exit on the south side of the street by the next to the airport, where people won't mind it so much, with the wider, deeper parcels, that's where it makes sense. So you should actively encourage it to be there, which means upzoning it to allow for redevelopment. Another piece which I just want to say is about framing sort of industrial versus the non-uses. The way our economic development sub-consultant Kevin put it to us, he was like, the way he asked the question is one that I think is worth repeating, which is, are you sure you want, like, hypothetically, are you sure you're okay with getting rid of industrial zoned areas to do other things, right? It's like the click yes to confirm kind of a thing, right? Like, so we don't want to click yes to confirm. So we need to protect it in certain areas. That's the main play. And the last thing is, John, I saw John has a question about on Amherst Street. What about the traffic flow?
Well, let's go to the go over to the right of the board. Let's explain the carriageway in more detail, because the carriageway is both placemaking and it's also about traffic flow. So can you go there, Will?
Oh, so I'm following Andrea driving. I'm sorry. Okay, so right. So if you take, is my internet out? Can you all still?
No, we can.
We can hear you.
Okay, I was worried that was a repeat of before. Okay, so there's the same number of lanes.
But you have to explain the drawing, Will, the before and after. Please, you have to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first
Will,
thing is,
Will, can you make this bigger?
Can you see it better now?
Yeah, that's
okay.
helpful.
Even a little bit bigger, Will. There you go.
Yeah, because we're not seeing it and we don't know it like you do.
Thank you.
This is a constant problem of Will's, by the way.
I know. This is,
and that's the only reason I'm here.
All right. So same number of lanes. We're just making the lanes thinner. So when on the lanes in the middle, those lanes are for getting in and out of the area, right? So for the industry, for the trucks, they hop on that, they get on the exit, they move on with their day, right? For what otherwise feels like a lot of traffic, where there's so many lights and all that other kinds of stuff, as much of that we can pull onto the carriageways, we would encourage basically being able to exit off of that once you're going to start, patronizing one of those kinds of businesses. So in terms of lights, the idea here would be that since we're dividing through access versus sort of stopping, parking, looking for a place, going to whatever's on the side, that would very likely mean that streamlining the lights in sort of for that through piece would be a fundamental piece of it. Because what we need to do is make sure that the trucks and the times when sort of the logistical access in and out stays clear. Because right now it's bad for everyone. There's a bajillion lights, it's congested.
Curb cuts, right.
It stinks for anything that's cars. It's actually like not ideal for everyone. So we have to separate the incompatible things a little bit. So one is shrink the lanes a little bit, but keep the same number of lanes to sort of have the through. Then put this verge or median strip or whatever you want to call it as the place where you can fit stormwater management space away from the through part, so it's not so scary to non-car uses. And then also next to it, stick a bike lane, right? And the bike lane is on the business side of things, right? Parting the front, whatever in the back for a mullet, right? We're gonna have the bike lane and the thoroughfare and the carriageway on the other side. We have room for that slower traffic carriageway. And we think you should put diagonal parking between that and the businesses. It does a couple different things. Diagonal parking is fairly efficient, right? So it allows for the travel of cars on and off of it, but it also creates that New Englandly sense of place where in like smallish towns throughout Massachusetts and New Hampshire, when you get to the Main Street district of a place, that's sort of where you can kind of see being able to pull off and park at a place. But it's not
Concord, New Hampshire is a very good example. They just redesigned the main commercial district with there's a picture up there with diagonal parking in front of the shops and things.
Now, of course, this isn't all the parking you need for all the businesses. We're talking about a much higher level of density than that particular main street. So there's still parking in the back, but you have some of it that's right there. And And then of course you've got a wider sidewalk. Now all of this stuff leaves room for more public realm work, right? In between these buildings, there's places where, you know, there should be little places to sit, right? Like little plazas in between the different buildings, especially upon the nodes at the major intersections. That's another key component once you get a better critical mass along all of this, because the only way this would ever actually realistically be a place where people are enjoying biking and or walking on these new sidewalks is if there's like that activity on the street. And so we have to leave room for those kinds of interventions as they're happening.
You see this kind of realignment and redevelopment happening in places like Chestnut Hill and Newton outside of Boston, where there were shopping, but the market did this before the city started to legislate or to require it, which is that there were classic shopping centers with large parking areas on the front and the buildings pushed to the back. And there's a repositioning of one of these called the street, and they've done precisely this. They've put a kind of neighborhood scale stuff much closer to the kind of throughway, which is Route 9 in that case. And they've put the parking in the back, and you walk through these kind of pedestrian areas, and you actually access the stores from the kind of happy main street side. That also allows, because some of these parcels are super deep, for developers even to be clever and have even more traditional big box even behind. So that's the vision for this. The other thing is that it creates for those subdivisions that are along Amherst Street. It'll require some public realm work, but places that people can walk and bike to that have a little bit more of a neighborhood feel. Are you still there? Will?
Yeah. Yes, to Peter's question, kind of like that's a carriage road. We do have access management required right now, and there's many places on Amherst Street, like you can go from behind Target to what is now the Fronteras, used to be Chili restaurant, to that back road to that gas station. But those access management ways are kind of in the rear of all the buildings, and what is being suggested here is bringing that to the front so that there is space to accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists and more of that green space that makes it not feel like every other corridor in the country, and that so that it forms the public space up front. I believe somebody touched on it earlier, you know, using a form-based code to kind of really ensure that we're talking about how the public space feels, and that's a big part of what they're talking about in this conversation.
If you could pan, Will, to the images at the top. One is Concord and one is some old postcard I found as a kind of visual reference. I don't know who's driving the screen, but
I am. Yeah. Here
I think, you know, these are the touch points that we're talking about. One is a little bit more nostalgic, Mayberry RFD kind of era, and the other is the impressive public realm improvements that were done in Concord. And I think what's smart about this from a development standpoint is that all of those retailers are still going to want to have a brand presence from the through traffic. And so we think this will work better than putting everything behind and turning the back to 101 to Amherst Street, because this is a kind of hybrid model that recognizes that, you know, 99% of the people are coming by car, but that, you know, when you get out of your car, you might park once and do a couple of things instead of parking in one parking lot, driving to the other one. The other advantage of this, we think, is that while we showed cute little buildings that are probably about 65 feet deep in our representation, big buildings could define this edge too. If somebody wanted to build a bigger commercial building or a commercial office building, a 3-story or 4-story office building, as long as they put their entrance to the building on that face and had some diagonal parking spots, the depth of the buildings that run back off the system is actually quite flexible, or even the width, quite frankly, because somebody mentioned it looked a little bit too dense. But what's key is there's enough, you know, over time with this development pattern, if it's built out over time, you don't want overly large gaps between the buildings, so there's a continuity of experience, even if you're a pedestrian, as you're walking along certain sections of Amherst Street.
Will or Tim, I wonder if I could just ask a question about the sort of this carriageway idea on Amherst Street. So I know in the case of the Concord example, that was a public project, and that is Main Street and Concord. So all those buildings are already on the street, and so really it was largely just a street project and a sidewalk project. Whereas I think what we're envisioning here for Amherst Street is quite a bit more ambitious, and it seems like would involve cooperation and coordination with the private property owners. And I know one thing that we've seen from a planning perspective is where redevelopment is piecemeal and you're trying to introduce these concepts as redevelopment is happening, it can be hard to justify, putting the cost on a particular developer for a single redevelopment project as part of this sort of larger vision. So I'm just wondering, what are you sort of thinking about in terms of, is this more of a larger public project, or are you thinking of it more of something that happens as redevelopment occurs?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question, and we've been involved with many zoning initiatives that once the new zoning is implemented, the first couple of years, the world's a very funny place where you have, 6-story residential buildings that are meeting the public realm in a way right next to industrial buildings that house the Buffalo to Boston freight company. But the market over time, there is always a kind of messy early and messy middle when new rules are put into place. Our thinking as we were talking through this was that there would be a public project that would include a slight lane diet, from 13 and 12-foot lanes to 11, which is still, for the speeds that we're talking about, completely reasonable. The public project would include the verge, which would include green infrastructure, hopefully some street trees on the inbound side, and one of the two bike lanes on the inside edge of that. If you zero in to that, you can see where public and private the boundary is. So that the middle, that's a two-way cycle track, so that on either side of Amherst Street, you could go in either direction on a bike. You could build one of those bike lanes, the verge, and then the rest of it, we think, would be design guidelines for redevelopment that would be incentivized by upzoning in terms of density, and some tinkering of parking ratios and things to get the market to react. And it's my experience in the repositioning of shopping centers around Boston that it would even be a value add as a kind of one-off for developers as they did them, as long as there was coordination that those carriageways would eventually connect, which is starting to happen in the market, even, in Chestnut Hill and other higher value kind of commercial corridors. So I think the short answer is it would require patience and probably a combination of it's a state right of way, an ask about additional planning for the right of way, and then some land use regulation mechanisms that would include both zoning and design guidelines that would be used as part of a kind of project review template. But that's, Adam, that's kind of as far as we got. I don't think it's a land taking and a public project all the way back to the face of the buildings. I don't think that the market would respond to that. The market's going to like those diagonal parking spaces in front of their own buildings, I think.
But to answer the subtext of your other question, or part of the question, I think, was like the time frame on this, like a couple years. Is this a couple years where you go big? And no, because the corridor, for all its faults, which we are actively identifying here, it functions for what it is, and it's inappropriate as our job to just completely shift the whole thing out from everyone who's currently there. And so our job is to work on a vision right now that has public process where the idea makes sense, put the regulations in place so it can happen, and we actively incentivize it to happen via upzoning and other things, and do whatever's possible to see that through. But we can't force it to happen, and we definitely don't want to, and it would be too expensive to force it all at once.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, just a kind of further thought here. To us, this is an exciting hybrid that is neither turning everything into a walkable only, you know, I mean, this is an important commercial corridor. It's a current and future engine for Nashua's economy. This is like a commercial strip 2.0, and we're excited about it. It's still, you know, whether it's fossil fuel powered cars or electric cars, this is really designed for people to drive to mostly, get out of their cars and maybe spend a little bit more time here than a kind of in and out. And with the idea that you might shop at the big box retail store, you might park in the larger lot in the back, shop at Target, and then walk up to the cafe, all as part of your experience. And we're seeing that happen in some commercial corridors now, in, you know, Chestnut Hill and Bethesda in Maryland and other places where this kind of hybrid could be successful. It's still a commercial strip.
Bob's question, what's the impact on the rest of the city, specifically the existing downtown? That's an excellent question. I guess I don't know exactly what you mean by impact, so I'm going to riff. If you want to write another thing in there, I can try to answer it more directly. I mean, I think what's worth saying is that this, as Tim was just pointing out, you know, this is a really long stretch. This is we made a little tiny axon, a little slice of it for you, but were you to see this vision over a large portion of the corridor, that's a dramatic change for the city. That would become a defining corridor. I mean, it's already a defining corridor for the city at the moment, but as a redeveloped thing, that's a really big shift. It's very much not the downtown though. Like we are not proposing that the downtown just become another commercial corridor that sees a similar kind of improvement. I would say a better way to think about it is the downtown has its own set of changes or improvements that can be informed by this public process, right? Like, the way we're thinking about the role of this to downtown is how what we're envisioning here through this whole process is a reimagined public realm, right? Something where it's not just about cars and where the pedestrians, come first. And I apologize for the background for my additional tinkling soundtrack. Anyway, whatever. For how I would say, as far as what we would want to consider improving or changing downtown, it would be some aspect of this for the public realm, right? There are lessons from this that we'd like, drawing people from downtown to this area. Well, then yes, absolutely, because all we need to do is get you from downtown to here via enough of a car to get you to sit your butt down.
Yeah, but I think, Will, I think
stores.
Well, I think the question has to do with, the malls killed downtowns. Will this kill the downtown? I think that's the impetus for these questions. Before you answer the wrong question.
Just real quickly, before we answer either of those questions, and I love where this conversation is going. We have about 5 minutes left. We're
just getting started.
I know. That's why we're talking on April 6th, right? So we will have 2 breakout sessions on the public when we're having these same conversations in the public forum, and we'll do it in 2 different breakout rooms. So everybody will get to talk about both of them. The first one would be just about corridors, and then we'll come back and then go back into our breakout rooms, and then we'll talk about Danny Webster just in the second one. So if you do have any questions, make sure that you just drop them in the chat, and we can make sure we answer all of them. I just did want to give you a quick time update, as I know that some people may have to run. So go ahead, answer the question. I love where you're going.
It's a very simple one, which is that I don't think this cannibalizes downtown at all, right? This isn't just retail. This is all the other stuff. Like the retail is there to help make it vibrant, but really what we're talking about is a dramatic potential with redevelopment increase in roofs with people living in them, and roofs with people working in them, and all of those people will ideally be wanting to eat at restaurants, and they may not be right on Amherst Street. So I would say that our goal is actually all the things that aren't just restaurants, and the restaurants are there to help make the whole thing work. So I don't think it cannibalizes it at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's quite that simple. I mean, the truth is that where this is happening naturally through sophisticated retail developers, these are still chains. It's Shake Shack, it's FOMU, whatever that stuff is. It's not the local restaurateurs. It's national chains that are starting to like this model, but aren't going to go into an existing space downtown. You know, so that's one answer. But that also can cannibalize, you know, local restaurants, downtowns too. I was going to put it in the chat, but I'll just mention that a really good example of this, which is being rebalanced now, is that Shrewsbury Street, which was an old commercial corridor that ran out of downtown Worcester, in the 80s and 90s, pulled a lot of the more interesting restaurants out of the downtown along Shrewsbury Street. And so the city, Worcester, had to make some policy decisions to make sure that the balance was there. So I think that it's something that we should consider. We shouldn't just dismiss it as an issue. On the other hand, you know, we think it's important that placemaking happen everywhere. We don't believe that you placemake in one place and then you write off commercial strips as unattractive places, but you still need them for the tax base too. So I think that's another way to answer it, perhaps.
But we think there are things that you need to be doing on Main Street and in downtown, right? At the moment, you know, there's already a lot of stuff happening in the downtown. There's all these temporary installations going on. You know, I know that outdoor dining is again a thing, and you know, that idea of reclaiming the sidewalk and even some version of the right of way with constraints for that's an essential piece to maintaining the, what do you want to call it, unique and competitive qualities of downtown versus this. And so I would say that the best answer to sort of avoiding drawing too much out of it is to also continue to invest in having downtown be a place where those businesses are allowed to thrive.
I think that's a great point, Will. And I just want to throw in, there is housing out here. We have a ton of new housing coming in on Amherst Street. And with the mixed use that's allowed now out there, as more and more housing develops, this is a way to accommodate kind of those short trips right there and create a livable, walkable space. Because right now, some of the biggest complaints we get on Amherst Street are its lack of pedestrian and bicycle amenities and how it doesn't feel like a livable, walkable space, even though so many people live there very affordably. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well.
Absolutely. Before we don't have to wrap up, we could. Does anybody else have any questions? Bob James, so the residential development in downtown needs to increase in order to continue to support the businesses there, which we do see happening. Yes.
I think we have almost 400 units that will be under construction before the end of this year in downtown. So that's a substantial increase. And we've had almost 500 built in the last, we've had more than 500 built in the last just 3 to 5 years. So we are seeing a very substantial change in residential development downtown. And the great news is that some of it's very affordable and some of it's market rate. And so that's a really nice mix. And I think as you're suggesting, we will see that reflected in the supporting retail, commercial, other services in downtown as these units come online.
Okay. Anyone else? Any other rapid fire questions? While you think about that, if you come up with any over the next, what is it, a week basically, please feel free to write them down so that you can jump right into it and really kick off and start the conversations. Because as we all just experienced, it takes a little bit of time to kind of sink in, right? And to really kind of get those wheels turning. So as you are all ambassadors in having these conversations in the public, it would be great to be able to start and kick off the conversations with the knowledge that you now have, and kind of the answers that you have. So please invite, there you go. Perfect. Next steps. So please invite, get the word out there, invite people to come and be a part of this conversation. I think it's really exciting, as I know you do as well. And just keep using, we will keep up the social pinpoint. So feel free, if you haven't checked it out in a week or so, there's lots of new comments you can agree with or disagree with, or add some of your own. Specifically, now that we've had this conversation, it would be worth a revisit to maybe add some more context around this conversation. That is all that we have. Does anybody else have any? Oh, and also, we will be scheduling second topic area focus groups during May. So to go back into those individual buckets to kind of expand that conversation, where we're moving more from goals to the action items. The overall consensus, the goals are great, and people naturally want to start talking about how do we take action. So look for that. They're not set yet, but will shortly, and we'll be seeing that throughout May. Any other questions? Yeah.
There's just one final note for you all. Basically, we started with a lot of the sort of draft recommendations where they are right now, so you can get your eyes on them. We will be posting them after the public meeting, so they're there. But as you could see, trying to do that plus the scenarios uses up a lot of time, and it ends up making your brain explode a little bit. So that's why for the public meeting, we're going to really be focusing on those two scenarios as a way to talk about the different kinds of issues. We will announce that the recommendations are there. We will solicit feedback on it going forward, especially during those focus groups. But really, just so you know, it'll be more streamlined at the actual public meeting on those two visions, what people see and what questions people have. That's all I want to say about that. If there's any other questions, please feel free to ask. But that's what we're chugging away on between now, in the public meeting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Will. And just a quick reminder that you can always find any of this information on the website. When you're having a conversation with somebody and they ask you a question, you don't know what it is, they can find it on the website. So you can give that as a tool to people to kind of keep that information and figure out, what's next, what's going on, to review, go back and gain some more depth to any specific topic that may come up. So thank you all so much, and we will see you on April 6th. Have a good night.